The officer's pen froze midair. His eyes flicked to the file, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized something was very wrong. Mark, standing just behind me, tilted his head, that smug, overconfident smirk playing across his face, but it wavered, just slightly, at the edges. Officer Taylor adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, lips pressing into a thin, controlled line, hands poised, steady yet deliberate. That single glance at the papers had shifted the balance in the room. I could feel the subtle tremor in authority, the hidden acknowledgment of a discrepancy invisible to anyone else. I gripped the clipboard tighter, knuckles pale beneath the neatly pressed papers. Around us, the office buzzed softly with whispers and footsteps, but my focus narrowed to the microcosm before me. Mark leaned forward slightly, confident in his control, unaware that I had already traced patterns in the documentation: dates, signatures, notarized stamps, proof of income, the $7,500 adoption fee. Everything aligned perfectly, save one sheet, an overlooked clause that could reverse the entire situation in a heartbeat. Officer Taylor's hand hovered over that sheet for a moment longer. Then, in a voice low enough that only I could catch, he said, "If this file is ignored, the adoption could be delayed or canceled entirely." Mark's eyes flicked toward me, the smirk faltering into tension. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his tie, tried to mask the faint tremor in his hands, but it was too late. The tiny imperfection in the paperwork was already wielding authority, silently dictating the room's momentum. I stayed calm, exhaling slowly. Every micro-expression, every twitch, every fleeting glance mattered. Mark's arrogance was palpable, but beneath it lay cracks only patience and observation could exploit. His confidence, once a weapon, now revealed vulnerability. Each subtle shift, the tilt of his shoulders, the flicker of his brow, was a map I was reading silently, planning the inevitable pivot. The fluorescent lights reflected off the polished linoleum, families waiting in hushed tones, oblivious to the silent chess game unfolding. Officer Taylor's subtle frown deepened as he scanned the documents. One page, slightly out of alignment, held the key. His micro nod, barely perceptible, confirmed he had noticed the irregularity. That tiny acknowledgment, so easily overlooked, sent a ripple of unease across the space. Mark's hands twitched again, a brief, involuntary sign of panic. I observed everything, every gesture, every minor detail, my mind quietly cataloging the leverage I would soon command. I allowed a fraction of a smile, imperceptible, almost a whisper to myself. Patience was my ally, silence my weapon. The room continued in its mundane rhythm, yet beneath it, a slow burn tension coiled tighter. Every second stretched, charged with subtle authority, anticipation, and psychological chess. The adoption papers were no longer mere documents, they were instruments of power, poised to rewrite roles and perceptions. Mark's smirk wavered one last time. He glanced at me, searching for a clue, a reassurance that all was normal. Officer Taylor's gaze remained fixed on the document, steady, controlled. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted one corner of the critical sheet. The air tightened, the balance delicately poised, and in that suspended moment, I realized how fragile arrogance can be when faced with quiet, methodical observation. A faint shuffle of paper echoed through the office, unnaturally loud in the tense stillness. I breathed evenly, letting the weight of the moment linger. Mark shifted again, too conscious now of the room's new rhythm. Officer Taylor's micro-frown deepened. His nod toward me was subtle, yet it confirmed everything. The imbalance had begun. One overlooked clause, one small error in the carefully orchestrated paperwork would soon rewrite the entire story. I didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. Authority, patience, and careful observation had begun their silent revolution. The stage was set. Every micro-expression, every twitch, every fleeting glance was a harbinger of the shift to come. And as the office hummed around us, I knew that the calculated vigilance I had maintained would transform into undeniable leverage, quietly, inevitably, and with absolute precision. The office hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of papers. But for me, the world had narrowed to Mark's smirk and Officer Taylor's unreadable gaze. As I watched him lean casually against the desk, he began, almost theatrically, to question my knowledge of the adoption process. "You really don't understand how these procedures work, do you?" he said, voice soft but sharp, just loud enough for the staff to lean in, waiting for a response. I stayed silent, letting his words float over me, noting the way his hand tapped insistently against the polished countertop. Every micro-movement, the curl of his fingers, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, spoke of confidence he didn't realize I was quietly dissecting. The staff, subtle in their allegiance, gave him faint nods, murmured affirmations, all tiny confirmations of the imbalance of power. They had no idea that my silence was not submission. Each step he took, each glance at the forms on the desk, I memorized. The notarized pages, the adoption fee line, the signatures marked with slight hesitation, $7,500, the proof of income, all quietly etched into my memory. The air seemed heavier here, stifling almost, the distant hum of the ventilation system masking the tension that made my chest press inward. Mark moved closer, lowering his voice just enough to let me hear the condescension dripping from his words. "Honestly, Sarah, you'll just have to trust me. I've done this before, so let the professionals handle it." His lips curled with that same infuriating smirk, a faint shadow crossing his otherwise confident expression whenever Officer Taylor glanced back at the file. The officer, still calm and composed, made no comment, but I caught the tiniest raise of an eyebrow, a signal, almost imperceptible, that he had seen something he wasn't letting anyone else notice. I shifted slightly, noting the subtle flickers of movement, the soft tap of a pen against the desk, the slight rustle of a stamped form, the gentle squeak of a rolling chair as a clerk repositioned it. These tiny sounds, drowned out by Mark's chatter, were, to me, the soundtrack of control, the indicators of patterns forming. Every rule of the adoption office, every line on the forms, every minor procedural expectation, the very rhythm of this bureaucracy was becoming clear in my mind, not as a trap, but as a map. His words, lightly condescending, continued, each one a calculated attempt to make me feel powerless. "I've handled applications like this hundreds of times. You just don't know what you're doing." Yet each syllable, each whispered nudge from the staff in his favor only made me more alert. I watched the microaggressions, the way the clerk tilted her chair slightly toward him, the subtle shift of her gaze when he spoke, the faint nodding of the assistant as if to validate his authority. It was all part of a pattern, a script of social control, and I was reading it like an open book. I noted the financial details again, quietly. The adoption fee, the supplemental document fees, notarized pages requiring precise signatures. Each number, each date, each slight variation in format or handwriting was a breadcrumb. $7,500, July 12th. Signature smudged ever so slightly. These were not mistakes. They were opportunities. Opportunities I would remember. Opportunities I would use. Mark's body leaned forward, a motion of dominance, but I observed the cracks beneath it. His smirk faltered when the officer's eyes swept past him, catching subtle irregularities in the file. Officer Taylor's pen hovered over the next line, then paused, just long enough for me to notice, just long enough to send a shiver through the air between us. The staff remained unaware, completely absorbed in the illusion of control Mark projected, but I was seeing through it all. A faint laugh escaped Mark as he tried to regain composure, leaning closer to me and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Relax, Sarah. Nothing's going to go wrong here." His words carried the authority he assumed, the confidence of someone certain he had every measure under control. But I knew differently. I had noticed every pause, every hesitant glance, every tiny hesitation in the paperwork. I knew the rhythm of this room. I knew where the vulnerabilities lay. I let him speak, continuing to appear the submissive, unsure partner, while inwardly cataloging every micro-moment. Each tilt of his chin, each subtle shift of weight, each slight adjustment of his cufflinks, they were markers in a map only I could read. Officer Taylor's calm presence, every nod, every pause, every slight lifting of the brows added layers to the invisible puzzle. This office, these documents, these people, they were all pieces of a structure I was quietly memorizing, preparing for a moment of inevitable correction. Even as Mark whispered another dismissive remark about my supposed incompetence, I made mental notes of every word, every tone, every facial tic. The staff, obedient in their small ways, followed cues I would later understand fully. Nothing was wasted. Every small act of condescension, every implied power play, every "you wouldn't understand" line became data, a sequence of cause and effect that I cataloged silently, methodically. I felt the isolation acutely, yes, the subtle gaslighting pressing in, but also the clarity that came with observation. The office rules, the financial structures, the notarized requirements, even the informal cues of the staff, all of it was being stored, arranged, and remembered. The injustice of the moment was palpable, but my mind was a calm observer, unaffected outwardly, cataloging details that would later become leverage. Mark gestured toward the documents again, impatiently, trying to assert dominance in front of Officer Taylor. "See, Sarah, this is simple. Just let me handle the steps." He didn't notice the slight frown crossing the officer's face, subtle but telling. He didn't notice the careful alignment of the papers I was watching, nor the faint tremor in his own hand when he realized the officer's attention had shifted to a particular line. The minutes stretched, each tick of the clock echoing louder in my mind than anywhere else. The staff continued their polite murmurs, reinforcing Mark's perceived control. Yet, in the corner of the office, I caught sight of a small discrepancy in one of the notarized forms, a misaligned stamp, a slightly faded signature. Small, easily overlooked, but visible to someone paying attention, and I was paying attention. As the conversation droned on, Mark's attempts at micro-dominance began to unravel ever so slightly. Officer Taylor's pen hovered over the questionable clause again, a subtle lift of the brows communicating more than words ever could. I maintained my calm, a quiet center in the storm of his belittling, every subtle insult absorbed, cataloged, and prepared for the right moment. The tension was palpable, and I knew the scales were slowly, invisibly tipping in my favor. By the time the office clock showed 30 minutes had passed, the quiet patience I maintained felt almost like a shield. Each gasping pause, each subtle microaggression, each financial notation, all recorded mentally, were pieces of the coming reversal. The humiliation pressed upon me, yes, but it was heavy with information, rich with insight. Each small smirk, each subtle nod from the staff, each line of fine print, everything mattered. And as Mark leaned back one last time, attempting the same dismissive grin, I allowed a tiny, almost imperceptible smile, not of triumph, but of quiet certainty. Officer Taylor adjusted his glasses again, eyes lingering over a line of fine print in the file, while Mark remained oblivious. The patterns were clear. The moment of reversal, subtle but undeniable, was quietly approaching, and I was ready. The office had emptied slightly after the midday rush, leaving Sarah with the quiet hum of fluorescent lights above and the soft shuffle of paper from distant desks. She remained seated just a few steps from Officer Taylor's counter, her fingers brushing over the leather-bound folder she had brought discreetly from home. The folder contained a careful compilation of adoption documents, receipts, and emails, the invisible backbone of her strategy. Every line of the paperwork had been scrutinized, every signature cross-checked. The adoption fee of $7,500, which had seemed standard at first, now revealed minor discrepancies when compared with the notarized receipts she had collected over the past few weeks. Sarah's pulse remained calm, her breaths measured, yet her mind was a storm of calculations, anticipations, and meticulous observations. She noticed small errors she had previously overlooked, a faintly misaligned stamp on one application, the ink of a signature slightly too bold, a date that seemed inconsistent with the timeline she knew. Mark sat nearby, casually scrolling through his phone, entirely convinced that the office and its rules were still under his control. He did not notice Sarah subtly taking notes in a small, leather-bound journal, her handwriting tiny but precise. She listed each anomaly she had observed, fee misapplications, missing initial signatures, minor deviations from the agency's checklist. The atmosphere was tense, though outwardly it appeared ordinary. A family in the corner laughed quietly over a completed adoption form, oblivious to the storm brewing silently across the room. Sarah's eyes flicked to Officer Taylor, who was reviewing a stack of files with professional detachment, unaware of the subtle patterns she had already detected in his handling of applications. She noted the way he adjusted his glasses, the slight frown when a page didn't align perfectly, small, almost imperceptible signs of human imperfection that would soon work in her favor. Her phone vibrated softly, a discreet message from a trusted attorney she had contacted weeks ago. Review all discrepancies. Never act without documentation. Patience is your power. Sarah smiled faintly at the text, her calm demeanor never breaking, yet the knowledge it conveyed felt empowering. She had taken every step meticulously, consulting legal advice, confirming the agency's internal rules, and even reviewing previous adoption cases available publicly. Each minor observation she had made over the past few weeks now formed a clear pattern. Mark, arrogant and self-assured, continued to underestimate the quiet diligence of his wife. His smirk, which had been so commanding during their first visit, now seemed almost performative, a fragile mask against the invisible strategy Sarah had constructed. Across the desk, Officer Taylor filed another stack of papers, occasionally muttering under his breath as he corrected minor errors. Sarah observed silently, memorizing the rhythm of his corrections, the sequences he followed, and the order in which he processed applications. Every small misstep was a piece of evidence she mentally cataloged. A slight crease on one form, the subtle shift of a paperclip, the way the desk clerk nodded unconsciously to Mark's comments, all of it told a story of human oversight and vulnerability. She knew she was building a quiet arsenal, and with it the potential for undeniable authority in the moments to come. Hours passed, yet Sarah remained composed. She arranged her notes in a precise order: financial anomalies first, procedural errors next, correspondence discrepancies last. The air of normalcy around her contrasted sharply with the silent intensity of her preparation. She observed Mark, imagining the moment when his arrogance would meet the immutable reality of documented evidence. Subtle shifts in posture, slight tension in his shoulders, the occasional glance around the office, these were the signals she anticipated, even if he did not yet sense the magnitude of what she had quietly compiled. She revisited each adoption file in the office, comparing them mentally with the copies she had brought from home. Each difference, no matter how minor, became a crucial fragment of the puzzle. The adoption fee documentation revealed patterns of miscalculation she had flagged. Certain notarized stamps didn't match the official date sequence. Officer Taylor's methodical handling of forms exposed tiny gaps in protocol that, combined with her collected evidence, would ultimately support the ethical reversal she was carefully engineering. Even as the office buzzed quietly with other families and staff, Sarah's mind worked in absolute focus. She silently rehearsed the way she would present the inconsistencies: calm, factual, unshakable. Her notes were precise, her timeline flawless. She imagined the eventual confrontation, not a heated argument, not shouting or emotional displays, but a calm unveiling of errors that would make her position irrefutable. Mark's confidence, so carefully maintained through subtle dominance and patronizing remarks, would crumble quietly under the weight of verifiable facts. She paused briefly, inhaling the office air, letting the ambient sounds, a fax machine buzzing, distant laughter, the soft murmur of typing, serve as the backdrop to her strategy. The quiet patience she had maintained since the initial humiliation in Part 1 now felt like an instrument of power. Every meticulous observation, every legal consultation, every documented discrepancy had been a step toward a reversal that Mark could neither predict nor prevent. The power of knowledge, preparation, and authority, hidden yet absolute, was hers. By late afternoon, Sarah had reviewed every file at her disposal, confirmed all her collected documents, and mentally rehearsed the sequences she would follow. The officer, still unaware of the depth of her observations, filed the last paper of the day and glanced toward her casually. Sarah returned his gaze, calm, composed, and with an unspoken understanding. She was no longer passive. The quiet, deliberate preparation of the past weeks had positioned her to claim control at the precise moment the office rules and evidence converged. Every small misalignment, every procedural lapse, every microaggression she had endured was cataloged, analyzed, and converted into leverage. Mark's smirk, the staff's quiet complicity, even the officer's minor oversights, all would contribute to the revelation that her patience, preparation, and strategic insight had made inevitable. And though she remained outwardly serene, internally she felt a growing certainty. The hidden preparation was complete, the reversal merely waiting for the right moment to unfold. The final note in her journal, written in her neat, precise script, read like a promise to herself. All pieces are in place. The truth will be revealed. Patience is the weapon. Evidence is the proof. Everything will shift quietly, but irreversibly. The quiet hum of the adoption office seemed almost deafening as Officer Taylor picked up the file I had quietly flagged during my previous observations. I noticed the slight crease on the notarized form and the misalignment of signatures that others had overlooked. My hands rested on the edge of my chair, calm and composed, while Mark's confident smirk began to falter subtly. "Wait a moment," Officer Taylor murmured, his voice low but commanding, and the pen in his hand hovered midair. Every eye in the office turned instinctively toward him, sensing the shift in the invisible hierarchy. The room held its breath. Mark leaned forward slightly, eyebrows knitting in confusion, clearly unprepared for this abrupt pause. I observed him, noting how his casual posture was cracking under subtle tension, yet he didn't dare speak. I had anticipated this exact moment, the authority noticing the discrepancy, the first real crack in my husband's arrogance. Officer Taylor's gaze lingered over the financial sheet, the adoption fee record of $7,500, and the supplemental forms showing misapplied fees exceeding $10,000. A faint flicker of alarm crossed his eyes, quickly masked by professional neutrality, but I had seen it, the quiet, deliberate pause of someone who realized there was more than what met the eye. Mark's hand twitched slightly, fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against the edge of the table, betraying his internal panic. Staff, who had subtly sided with him earlier, now shifted uncomfortably, sensing a change they couldn't articulate. I stayed poised, my expression serene, heart steady. Every movement I made was deliberate but understated, a gentle adjustment of my folder, a calm inhalation, hands resting over meticulously organized notes detailing each irregularity I had uncovered in the adoption files. Officer Taylor spoke again, his voice firm but composed. "These documents, the notarizations and signatures, they don't match our records." The weight of the statement settled in the room. The authority, finally intervening, revealed the truth without theatrics, leaving no room for manipulation or gaslighting. Mark's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a twitch of disbelief. My silence was a contrast to the growing tension around him. I could see the panic spreading in subtle waves. Mark's gaze darted to me, to the papers, to Officer Taylor. His control evaporated quietly but unmistakably. The staff shuffled, whispering softly, unsure whether to correct or follow the protocol. Meanwhile, I maintained a composed calm, the quiet power of patience and meticulous preparation, radiating outward without a single word. Officer Taylor continued, flipping to another page in the folder. Each detail I had documented, the financial missteps, procedural irregularities, and overlooked forms, surfaced naturally, forcing recognition. The discrepancy in fees over $10,000, minor errors in notarizations, and incomplete supplemental paperwork became the invisible threads unraveling Mark's carefully maintained confidence. My prior observation had ensured I knew exactly what would trigger this shift. Mark attempted to speak, to regain control, but his words faltered. Officer Taylor's nod was subtle, confirming what had to be enforced, proper legal procedures and accurate records. The office felt the gravity of the shift, a silent acknowledgment that the moral and procedural authority had sided with correctness, not arrogance. I shifted slightly, maintaining my calm composure, yet internally a small satisfying thrill ran through me. This was the culmination of quiet preparation, observing, documenting, and anticipating every misstep without ever revealing my hand too early. The power now balanced itself clearly: authority, truth, and patience over arrogance and assumption. The room settled into a tension-filled calm. Officer Taylor adjusted his glasses and made brief annotations on his clipboard, a quiet yet decisive confirmation of my observations. Mark's previous dominance evaporated into an uncomfortable awareness of his miscalculations. I remained still, letting the authority enforce order, my own strength demonstrated silently through foresight and preparation. The narrative tension was now palpable. Power had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. My meticulous attention to detail, the small inconsistencies, the timing of observations, all converged at this moment. Every micro-expression, every reaction of the staff, the slight faltering of Mark's confidence, and the decisive actions of Officer Taylor painted a tableau of silent triumph. Finally, Officer Taylor closed the file with a measured snap, a quiet punctuation that echoed the resolution's inevitability. Mark sat frozen, no longer able to manipulate or intimidate, while the office staff recalibrated their awareness of hierarchy and authority. I allowed myself a brief, controlled exhale, knowing the groundwork for complete resolution had been firmly established. Every number, every document, every micro-detail had aligned perfectly, reinforcing the psychological arc: injustice confronted by patience, preparation, and authority-based correction. The quiet victory of foresight, observation, and lawful leverage had set the stage for the final moral closure in Part 5. The room felt suspended in that delicate, quiet tension, the kind that holds every heartbeat in balance. Officer Taylor's gaze remained fixed on the adoption file, his pen finally resting in stillness. I could see the faint shift in Mark's shoulders. The arrogance that had once made him tower over everyone in the office had dissolved into palpable uncertainty. His smirk was gone entirely, replaced by the subtle twitch of lips trying to mask the panic flickering across his face. The staff, once subtly siding with him, straightened instinctively, suddenly aware that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "I need to verify a few signatures," Officer Taylor said evenly, voice calm but firm. His hands moved with precise authority, tracing the edges of notarized forms, cross-referencing with internal records. Every motion was deliberate, controlled, an unspoken reminder that here, legality and truth held absolute weight. Mark leaned closer, almost imperceptibly, as if proximity could shield him from scrutiny, but his tension betrayed the truth. He had overstepped, miscalculated, and the office would now see it. I remained silent, observing, every nerve alert yet unshaken. My hands rested lightly on the table, fingertips grazing my meticulously organized notes. Each number, each date, each financial entry I had quietly confirmed over the past weeks now converged into a subtle but undeniable pattern, proof of the over-applied fees, the misfiled signatures, and the procedural errors Mark had assumed no one would notice. My patience, my restraint, and my careful documentation were about to turn the tide. Officer Taylor's eyes flicked up at me, not with accusation but with acknowledgment. The subtle nod he offered carried weight far greater than any words could, validation of everything I had silently endured and meticulously prepared. Mark's chest rose and fell unevenly, jaw tight, as the consequences of his arrogance began to crystallize. I could see the internal calculation running across his face. There would be no charm, no intimidation that could reverse this moment. "According to our internal review and the verified documents," Officer Taylor said evenly, voice calm but firm. His hands moved with precise authority, tracing the edges of notarized forms, cross-referencing with internal records. Every motion was deliberate, controlled, an unspoken reminder that here, legality and truth held absolute weight. The adoption process must proceed under proper protocol, fees adjusted, forms corrected, signatures confirmed. The applicants meet all criteria and the file will move forward without any further obstruction. His calm authority resonated through the office, a quiet but absolute reversal of the imbalance that had defined the prior weeks. Mark slumped slightly into his chair, finally unable to sustain the facade of control. His smirk had completely vanished, replaced with the hollow certainty of a man outmaneuvered by methodical, patient truth. The staff exhaled softly, subtle relief mingling with the shock of seeing power exercised correctly, justly. I allowed myself a small, measured breath, quiet satisfaction, restrained but deeply felt, coursing through my veins. The battle was over, not with loud confrontation, but through law, observation, and unwavering composure. I stood, hands lightly clasped, eyes meeting Officer Taylor's briefly. In that glance, I saw respect, not for me personally, but for the quiet integrity that had governed my actions. No gloating was needed. The truth had spoken with irrefutable clarity. Mark avoided my eyes, the lessons of arrogance and underestimation now ingrained silently on his features. Walking toward the office exit, I felt the subtle gravity of victory settle around me. Every step was calm, deliberate, weighted with the knowledge that patience and law had restored balance. The adoption papers, now fully verified and ready, sat in the officer's care, a symbol of correctness and fairness, not favoritism or manipulation. I reflected briefly, internally, on what had carried me through. Dignity, silence, and observation, each quietly as powerful as any confrontation. The fluorescent lights glimmered softly on polished linoleum, catching the faint shimmer of the corrected documents. Staff moved with routine efficiency, yet I knew they had witnessed a subtle but unforgettable shift in authority. Mark remained seated, hands folded tensely, absorbing the consequences without words, his previous dominance completely nullified. I paused at the door, exhaled softly, and felt the culmination of calculated patience. Justice had arrived in the quietest, most complete way possible. And as I stepped out into the crisp daylight outside the office, a small, calm smile formed, not for revenge, not for triumph over another, but for the quiet confirmation that integrity, preparation, and restraint had won. One measured, composed victory, legal, undeniable, and lasting, etched itself into the rhythm of my life. The office, the fees, the papers, the authority, all had aligned, proving that silent patience and careful observation could command results far stronger than any overt confrontation ever could. The quiet strength I carried with me now was imperceptible to those unobservant, yet impossible to ignore by those who mattered. My journey had ended not in shouting, not in spectacle, but in the unshakable balance restored by law, precision, and integrity.